The continent we call Asia has undergone tumultuous change since this institution first began. The difficult processes of decolonisation, in some countries the rise of revolutionary movements which have since become enduring, long-established governments of their countries, the long and difficult processes of economic development, in many countries poverty having been transformed into prosperity, although in others poverty still remains. Large-scale social change brought about through the relentless processes of urbanisation, and more recently the ravages of climate change. In the midst of all of this, and all these great changes across our region, geopolitics has always loomed large. And it was against this background that John D. Rockefeller III, back in 1956, at the height of the Cold War, had the remarkable vision of establishing the Asia Society. His mission was straightforward: to build bridges between the emerging countries, cultures and economies of Asia with the United States. And intervening 2/3 of a century, this institution has proudly played host to political leaders from virtually every country across Asia. Sometimes their visits have been the subject of great controversy, other times more routine. But our mission has remained the same: to add light rather than heat to the discourse in order to find pathways through the seemingly intractable challenges of our age. We've done this through arts and culture, we've done this through education, we've done this through using our extraordinary convening power to bring together leaders from across politics, business and the other realms of public life in order to find common understanding where it could be found. The Asia Society, therefore, is a good institution. It's part of the firmament of our national and international discourse here in the United States and across our global network of 15 centres, and we're proud of the institution. Consistent with this tradition of forging common understanding across disparate cultures, the trustees of the Asia Society back in 2014 decided to establish the Asia Society Policy Institute. Indeed, Dr. Kay, back in 2014, you launched the Institute from this very same stage. Thank you for giving me a job. Because I was honoured by the trustees to become the Institute's inaugural president in 2015, not long after I came second in the Australian elections in the previous year. We began as an Asia Society Policy Institute with just 5 staff, and 7 years later I'm pleased to report that we are now supported by nearly 50 full and part-time staff, making us one of the larger concentrated policy research institutes focused on Asia here in the United States. Our mission statement, consistent with the Asia Society itself, is one of navigating shared futures. We see ourselves also as a think tank and a do tank. We're not into the business of just thinking alone. Thinking is the sound of one hand clapping. Thinking and doing is the sound of 2 hands clapping. And whether it is on US-China relations, on trade negotiations or on climate change, we have always seen our work as being one which translates theory into practice, rather than producing a report in the vain hope that somewhere there will be someone in the world who will read it at some stage. No, we see our role as working with the decision makers, both in Washington and other capitals across the Asia-Pacific region, in order to move the dial forwards, to interpolate our policy recommendations into the world of policy reality wherever possible. We claim no unique wisdom in doing this. We have always placed priority, however, consistent with our traditions, on how the other side thinks and why they think that way, rather than just acting as an unthinking cheer squad for whatever the current iteration of US foreign, trade or strategic policy might happen to be. And this brings us to what I hope will become the 3rd great innovation in the historical evolution of the Asia Society, which is the formal establishment within the Asia Society Policy Institute of a dedicated Centre for China Analysis. You might ask, why do we need another China Centre here in the United States? Well, the answer, I believe, lies in a number of factors. One is that it's important to bring together the full spectrum of China's specializations under one roof in order to bring together the best integrated analysis of contemporary China that is possible. My experience of the China analytical world, both here in the United States and across the rest of the world, is that there is no lack of analysis on different aspects of China's rise. What I find there is a lack of is synthesis in drawing the threads of disparate analysis together into an integrated whole that can make sense to policymakers. That is why the Centre for China Analysis will bring together expertise on Chinese domestic politics, China's domestic economy, new developments in Chinese society and culture, rapid advances in Chinese technology, as well as the most recent developments in Chinese foreign and security policy, and of course, China's impact on climate. In the minds of the Chinese leadership, all these things relate to each other. Therefore, I think it's useful for other international leaders to have available to them integrated analyses of Chinese politics and policy in a way that also relates the part to the whole. If there's a second distinguishing feature of the Centre for China Analysis, it'll be the priority we attach to Chinese language sources. Many of the debates on China's foreign and domestic policy are well ventilated by China's own domestic discourse, often freely available in its own public literature, assuming, of course, you know where to find it, and assuming, of course, you'll put in the effort to read the Chinese original sources. We therefore intend to make maximum use of Chinese domestic journals, publications, newspapers, and online information as the Chinese system itself seeks to communicate across the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people new directions in politics, the economy, and foreign policy. That's not to say we'll believe everything that we read, but it's important to understand how the Chinese system speaks to itself. It's what we describe in the CCA as our inside-outside angle of looking at China. And a third feature of the Centre for China Analysis is that we will be providing independent, robust, and vigorously objective analysis of where China is going and what it means for the United States and the rest of the region and the world. This means that we will be critical of Chinese policy whenever necessary, but also means we will bring a critical approach to bear on US policy, where we also judge that to be necessary. Finally, the Centre for China Analysis will work closely with the rest of the Asia Society Policy Institute, of which it is part, given that China's engagement with the rest of Northeast, Southeast and South Asia is of critical relevance both to the region and the world. I'm delighted that we've secured the services of a respected sinologist, Dr. Bates Gill, as the inaugural Executive Director of CCA. Bates brings expertise to this task, great expertise to this task, and I wish him well, and to the rest of his team. And Bates will be supported in this by my friend and colleague Chen Jing, who will be Managing Director of the CCA. CCA will also work closely with the Ross Centre on US-China relations under Vice President Orville Schell, given the formidable expertise available to that centre and the contribution it has already made to China scholarship through the outstanding publication that it has run for some time now called Chinafile. Today, therefore, is a great day for the Asia Society. We have a rich history. We also have a robust future. And when I speak of rich histories, Henry, and I speak of robust futures, I can think of no one more robust than Henry Kissinger to be with us today, to be an integral part of this important occasion, launching our new centre. Ladies and gentlemen, it is therefore with great pleasure that I officially launch the Centre for China Analysis of the Asia Society Policy Institute. So, Henry, thank you for being with us. It's good that you could come along. To start off on something really easy, let's talk about Xi Jinping's ideology. Now, you've met a few Chinese leaders over the years. You've met Mao Zedong, you've met Jiang Zemin, you've met Hu Jintao, and a whole bunch of others. And Xi Jinping is a leader that begins to talk more and more again about Marxism-Leninism. So, in your observation, what differences do you see between the Mao Zedong that you have met and the Xi Jinping that you've also met on many occasions? Over to you, Henry.
Well, first, let me thank you for your kind words. and also for inviting me. The project you're starting today is of great academic importance, but it's also of great foreign policy importance, because I think this is perhaps the most fraught international situation in terms of its evolution that I know. And the key issues are between two countries of substantially different cultural outlook and history on the nature of the world. And so an institution like this, of the scope that has been described, and led by a man whom I've known for decades and respected, and who has contributed so much to my own thinking, is a guarantee of an important contribution to the biggest international challenge of our period. Now, how do I perceive Xi? It's the characteristic of the Western approach to foreign policy, and especially the American approach, is to identify the policy of a country with the personality of its leader. And there is considerable merit in that. But when it's then taken to the point where the personal relationship between American or Western leaders and Chinese leaders are considered a key factor, then it fails to understand the essence of Chinese thinking about foreign policy as I perceive it, which is that history does not consist of the solution of specific problems, but that specific problems are part of a process which one has to master in order to conduct foreign policy. The elimination or the reduction of a problem is, in that view, an admission ticket to a new set of problems, to an endless set of problems. And that is what the statesman has to understand, rather than the immediate issues. So, of course, Mao and you also have to consider that I'm not a student of China from an academic point of view. I was involved in it because when we opened to China, Nixon thought I was the best informed person about his thinking for going to China, and also probably more controllable, since I was on his staff, than anybody else he could think of. So when I met Mao, the Cultural Revolution was still going on. Tens of millions had been killed under his aegis. But when I met him, he was eager to enlist America in an anti-Soviet policy, or at least to create the impression that America, in certain circumstances, might consider China an essential element of international affairs. So, in a very early conversation with him, he urged me to make sure that Japan continued to believe in its American alliance, and not think that China was trying to replace it as America's favorite Asian country. But this was clearly tactical position from which one couldn't draw any conclusions about the peaceful intentions. Mao was in conversations. He rarely stated his view in any continuous way. He invariably began the conversation with a question and then turned it into a dialogue that, as the confidence returned, became more and more aimed at his own strategic objectives, which were to isolate the Soviet Union. In our time, he did not cherish economic negotiations and was extremely reluctant to undertake them. In fact, in the 5th year of our opening to China, the economic relations with China were at the level of our relations with Honduras. The economic development of China occurred entirely under Deng Xiaoping. Having mentioned these mellow aspects of Mao, if one looks at his history and his subsequent policy or tone towards us, it became increasingly assertive as the danger of war diminished. But he kept his conversations with American presidents. I was present at the conversation with Nixon and the conversation with Ford. And I've described the beginning, but by the end, by my last conversation, he said something like this. He said, "You Americans remind me of swallows who fly up into the air when a storm approaches and flap your wings. But you and I, Professor," he said, "we know that the flapping of the wings does not affect the coming of the storm." And so there was, at that point, a kind of sinister aspect to that conversation. So Mao appeared as an ideologist who was practicing strategic policy for Chinese tactical reasons, and led to no ultimate conclusions, he professed no ultimate conclusions where it would lead as it evolved. But from what I know about his life, his treatment of the Soviet Union, he would have tried to assert Chinese eminence in a manner that it never looked as if China would have to accept policy directions or even policy advice. So he was a figure of great strategic competence, but philosophically, from the combination of what one knows about him now and even of his conversations with me, I would say he would raise great strategic questions about his ultimate aims. I met Xi in an earlier stage of his career before he was president. But I think he was already vice president. I'm pretty sure he was already vice president. And he, of course, had no record. And he couldn't evoke the same mystical atmosphere around his advisors than what I'm talking about. But in his early conversations with me, the Cultural Revolution was still a living experience. And I asked him about what its impact would be on future Chinese generations. And he described it as a searing experience in which, and his father, who was purged, and he and his father had to live in a cave for a period of time, which he described not with self-pity, but with the conclusion, this is not something we should now regret. This is something that strengthened us, and it made us capable of facing almost any challenge. And therefore the Cultural Revolution, on the whole, was a good thing for China, even though he personally and his family suffered extremely. Again, the Qi that I have experienced has, of course, two parts. One, he is very conscious, in my observation, of the requirements of power, and that is obvious. But it's also, at least again in my conversations, been quite reflective about the kind of international system that he would want or prefer. And he would speak of win-win situations. And on the other hand, he leaves no doubt that he will not rely entirely or primarily on the goodwill of the system. And he wants to create an international situation in which win-win is based on a classical balance of power. And he probably thinks a lot about that. Because I've also known some of his close personal associates. So he is a formidable adversary. And one should not gear one's policy or one's addresses to him on the basis of some conversion that would make him change his judgment either about internal order or international order. And he seems to be also extremely conscious that the great tragedies in Chinese history have occurred as a result of internal collapse, and that he would want to forestall that. The question that is now open, whether it is possible to create a diplomacy with them that permits a resolution of the threatening impacts on humanity by diplomatic means, or whether the relationship has to be based entirely on an assessment of two sides that are constantly building their strengths. There's no substitute for building strengths, and one cannot use the argument for dialogue with him on the idea that one therefore needs less military capacity. But the question exists whether it is possible to create a kind of conversation with him that moves away from the Maoist perception of the world to a Chinese Marxist one. My instinct is that he uses Marxism as the best tool for centralized power, and not as Mao would, as a kind of distinct religion. As you know, Kevin, I have advocated the need for dialogue, and I believe it is possible. It will be a sober process without exaltation, but it should be possible on the basis of a recognition of the forces that drive the world right now towards a very dangerous conflict, and make the conflict so devastating. So that has been my basic view during the Xi presidency, and it's a key issue before our society, and not a partisan issue.
So your argument overall in the current relationship is what I would describe as strategic engagement through continued enhancement of, or based on the continued enhancement of American strength as well. That you cannot detach engagement from strength, that in fact strength provides the basis for effective engagement.
But nor can you detach strength from outcomes and simply judge it by a theoretical assessment of a constantly evolving, changing technology. So it is a task no society has faced in that form previously.
You mentioned before in your discussions with Mao, some years ago now, the question of the Soviet Union. And Mao's then interest, deep interest in engaging you in what was then his unfolding dilemma with the Soviet Union following the Sino-Soviet split and the emergence of conflict on the Sino-Soviet border. You also referred to Mao's analogy about storms and swallows flitting into the air and flapping their wings furiously. So let's flip forward 50 years and talk about the successor of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Putin. Things are not going terribly well in the Ukraine. I think that's the understatement of the week. This was a military venture launched in February, which has turned into military and political and foreign policy folly. Given your deep engagement with successive Chinese leaders, how do you think Beijing now looks at Russia and Putin, and where this could lead, given the emerging speculation about the durability of Putin's leadership? And where does that end up in geopolitics?
Well, they have a number of conflicting emotions. When one looks at the conversations of Xi with Putin following the Olympics, but prior to the invasion of Ukraine by the Soviet Union, Xi gave a rather blank check to Putin by saying the alignment is indissoluble, and he must have expected that Putin would succeed.
Without limit, I think he said. A relationship without limit.
And simultaneously, he came out against NATO expansion. So if Putin had succeeded in occupying Ukraine, in the subsequent confrontation, China would have put itself on the side of Russia in the confrontation with whatever part of Europe would resist him, or all of Europe if it resisted him. And so that must have reflected his judgment of the balance of power at the moment, because he had no need to get himself into that issue. So he will have to adjust his thinking and Chinese policy to the reality of a much weaker Russia than he had estimated, or that anyone had imagined at the period. And it will raise totally new problems, namely, first, a technical problem. What if you've proclaimed your alliance? At what point are you obliged to give some help without destroying the validity of your assertions of support? But he seems to have decided to accept the damage here. But if Russia approaches collapse, which is now possible, will he interpret this as a forerunner of ambitions we might develop towards China, and therefore the need for policies that forestall any such expectations on our side, and therefore some growing activity in a yet not existing peace process. Overly concluded as some evolutions that he will have to accept, build its strengths, but attempt to avoid getting into the same position that Putin got himself into, and therefore begin a more conciliatory dialogue with the United States. I actually think that is the conclusion he will reach, and that this is what may emerge from the party Congress. But if he comes to that analysis at a moment that the Chinese internal situation weakens greatly, he may then have to conclude, or may then conclude, that nationalism is its best way to avoid the tendencies that might emerge. I tend to believe that he will attempt the former and reserve the issue of confrontation for a later point in his administration. And we should always have in mind that we shouldn't foreclose a more deliberate effort by the two countries to bring about a more peaceful structure, because I really don't believe they have an alternative of war with the kind of technology of automatic weapons for which nobody has any experience in their use, where decisions will lead to escalation by the briefness of time that is available to them and the limited experience one has with the actual use.
Yes, autonomous weapon systems changes the entire nature of politics and warfare. You think when Xi Jinping looks back on his fateful conversation with Vladimir Putin on the 4th of February, he will have some levels of regret, it seems.
He must.
Because, as you know, in Sun Art of War, the first chapter reads, "War is a great matter of state. If you lose the war, you lose the state." And Vladimir the Impaler seems to have forgotten this fundamental principle because he has rolled the dice with Ukraine and it has turned out profoundly badly for him. But on your strategic implications, you chart two possibilities. One, if Russia continues to lose in Ukraine, which seems at this stage militarily probable, and second, that there are further implosions within domestic Russian politics, perhaps even culminating in the very Russian state itself, then under those circumstances, Xi must suffer some level of damage domestically, politically in China for having thrown in his lot in an unqualified fashion. But beyond that, what your argument is it then goes either of two ways. Xi Jinping with the United States then is looking at possibilities of calming it down with America, restabilising the relationship in a more benign fashion, for which some preparations seem to have been made at some level, it seems, in recent weeks. Or he plays the nationalist card domestically and becomes much more assertive, believing that's the best way to, as it were, consolidate his domestic political position if it takes damage because of the decisions over Putin in February. But your on-balance judgment, if I've read you right, Henry, is the former rather than the latter, that he would seek a new opening with America. And we may see something of that, you think, when the two leaders sit down in Bali on the margins of the G20 next month? Am I reading you correctly on that?
That's a correct summary of my view. Quite accurate. But I would also emphasize we should remain internally, in terms of our domestic discussions of the future of world order, in a state of mind that one keeps us strong enough to prevent being overwhelmed or dictated to, but also insightful enough so that we can create the possibility of an evolution that systematically attempts to eliminate the dangers that modern technology imposes on us, and whose automaticity needs to be controlled in some fashion.
We've got about 10 minutes or so left, and you've been generous with your time. Turning to Biden and Xi meeting in Bali next month, I've written about something called managed strategic competition, strategic guardrails, non-lethal competition in the rest of the relationship beyond Taiwan and the usual strategic red lines and flashpoints, and even room for collaboration, climate and the rest. And you've talked about not just coexistence, but co-development, and I think your preferred term is co-evolution. So if you're sitting in the Oval Office at the moment with President Biden, or you're sitting in Zhongnanhai with Xi Jinping, then what would be the line of advice that you would provide them about how to stabilize this relationship?
Well, people here whom I can't see because of the lights.
They're just friends. There's 2 or 3 of them there. Yes,
ought to understand that I may be able to analyze a problem correctly without putting on the table by my own efforts a total plan of what to do. But I have had, I think, something like the following needs to happen. The two leaders in their conversations with each other, and one of them should be the first to say so, is we have a lot of problems and we cannot help impinging on each other around the world. But we ought to come to an agreement that we will not permit actions that we knowingly, which we know will lead to war between us, and we ought to agree among ourselves that this will be a guiding principle, and that we are going to set up some system. For example, a group on each side assigned that task, reporting directly to us. That would have the benefit, and it would even be conceivable that this be done on a track 1.5 level that is not fully governmental, to permit some flexibility in exploration. Starting with the assumption that neither side can be defeated by subterfuge and without noticing it, and that we will attempt to deal with it in this manner. It may not work, but some dialogue has to be created other than what is now going on, which is very rare and always based on mutual accusations and no concrete proposals of what to do about it. And if one attempts to deal with Taiwan directly, it becomes an insoluble issue in the domestic politics of each side. So suspending informally provocative statements by either side for a period or permanently would be, in my view, the best way to permit its existence as an autonomous entity, as it has for 50 years, without forcing the Chinese into excessive acts or us into excessive statements. But this is the philosophy with which I would recommend approving it, but it's not a political plan for that. One needs staffs to do that more fully.
So, Henry, you've written another book, Leadership, 6 Studies in World Strategy. It's a New York Times bestseller. How are the sales going?
They're always inadequate for
Amazon, Henry's book, subscribe, buy when you get out of here. But I'm reliably informed that your sales are much better than mine for my book, so why am I not surprised by that? But you studied these 6 leaders. In reflecting on their role and your own role between China and the United States over the last 50 years, how do you conceive of your own role today? And how have you conceived it?
Of course, studying the nature of American foreign policy has been my life's activity for over 70 years now. But in beginning to learn about the technology of the period and beginning to understand the nature of the Chinese cultural approach to its role in the world, I have tried to understand the Chinese. And on my first visit to China, where we had a whole list of complaints and issues, with of course with Nixon's approval, I concentrated on mostly abstract problems because I thought it would be the beginning of if it succeeded, of a long conversation. And therefore to list all our grievances. And one can see that in the text. For example, we still had troops in Taiwan, and I said, we can't talk about removing them until the Vietnamese War ends. So to link our problems, but I never said that publicly. And so I have tried to convey my understanding, regardless of what administration was in office, of American trends to the Chinese, and what I learned from the Chinese to the Americans. And I did not come after I left office with any immediate decisions to be made, but left it open to extensive presentations, and that I've done that with every administration on our side and on their side. And so that's the level at which I may or may not have contributed.
Last question for me is, you've got a team of young aspiring diplomats and some not so young but still aspiring diplomats here with the Centre for China Analysis, the Asia Society Policy Institute. You've had a remarkably successful career, formerly as America's chief diplomat, but also in post-political life as America's senior unofficial diplomat. What's your advice to junior woodchucks like me and my team about how to continue to have an effect, a useful effect?
If you look at my life, and you would try to write a plan to get through its various stages, you would never dare to do that, because I was in politics, insofar as I was in politics. The person I was most closely associated with, and who was a close personal friend, was Nelson Rockefeller. So you wouldn't expect that this is a road to become security advisor to Richard Nixon, whom I had never met, and to whom, in fact, I was opposed, even if I never was in a public role. And Nelson Rockefeller, when Nixon offered me that position, I, from a career point of view, made the foolish mistake of saying, I have to discuss this with Nelson Rockefeller. So if any of you want to have a career, never do that. And Nixon told me, take a week. My request didn't deserve that, but that's what I would. So then I went to Nelson, and Nelson said, has it ever occurred to you that Nixon is taking a much bigger chance on you than you on him? And so that was the inspiration to accept it immediately, as I should have done. And I said it only to say the best advice I can give for career is to do what most moves you at the moment and engage in it substantially and not keep an eye out for opportunities for advancement, but because the world has become so uncertain that your predictions, that you cannot predict the future, but you can predict your actions. So that is what I say to people, young people who ask me what they can learn from my life. But I don't even say that universally valid. That is my strong view.
Well, it's not a bad strong view to have. So the moral of the story is the Rockefeller name hangs over both of us. Nelson in your case, John D. Rockefeller III in our case here at the Asia Society. Henry Kissinger, thank you so much for being our guest at the Asia Society.